So where this leaves us is with these sorts of dueling understandings of monopoly. On the one hand, we're saying that when firms have market power, they're going to charge a price above marginal cost for their output. As a result, they're not going to be able to sell a socially efficient amount of output. In other words, there's going to be people who value a product at more than the cost of the resources needed to produce that product, who aren't going to end up consuming it, right? And that's going to result in a social loss. So that's the bad side. But then on the better side, we've argued that the ability to become a monopoly, the ability to gain market power and therefore earn monopoly profits, can be an incentive for firms or for individuals to innovate, right? To develop new products, to develop new production techniques, in the knowledge that they'll be able to recoup some of the costs of producing those products through the ability to charge an above marginal cost price. So given all this, what's the best way to approach monopolies, or the best way to approach market power from a public policy standpoint? So one option would be to break them up. Right, if our problem with monopolies is that firms with market power produce above price, are able to charge a price above marginal cost because they don't have competitors, why don't we just take one big firm, split it up into a couple of little firms? So this was done, one of the classic examples of this was in the 1980s, AT&T had a monopoly on landline actual telephone infrastructure through the entire United States and Canada. And a judge ruled that they were using that monopoly to keep competitors from providing telephone services, telephone connections to customers, in order that they be broken up into a large number of smaller regional companies. So the argument here, right, the benefit of doing this is pretty straightforward. It's that instead of having one firm, right, that can set a monopolist price, I'll have a bunch of firms that have to bid against each other and have the price fall down closer to marginal cost. The disadvantage of doing this, though, is that it can result in its own kind of economic losses when we have what we'll call a natural monopoly, which is to say that when one firm has economies of scale, right, is able to produce output at a lower cost than would many firms, breaking that firm into smaller pieces is likely to result in higher overall costs. So what does this mean? Let's imagine that we had a firm, let's say that the cost of, landline calls, the marginal cost was constant, but we had some fixed cost. So their average total cost was constantly decreasing, right? The economically efficient thing to do would be to produce where market demand, right, inverse demand equals marginal cost. Let's say that I've got a demand like this, right? The economically efficient level of output would be right here, right, producing at marginal cost. Of course, if firms tried to do that, they would make a loss because they wouldn't recoup any of their fixed costs. So if we take this firm and we break it up into two chunks, this has an advantage because instead of having the firm charge a monopoly price like this, right, it would have to charge a price closer to its marginal costs. It would have a disadvantage because now we have two firms paying these large fixed costs. And so it could be, right, that our cost per unit of telephony produced would actually be higher because we broke up a natural monopoly. Now, that said, in a lot of cases when we talk about breaking up monopolies, we don't necessarily just mean actually splitting a large company into several smaller companies. Sometimes what we're talking about is doing things to reduce the level of market power that companies have. So as another phone-related example, in the mid-90s, once cell phones started to become a thing, phone companies owned the numbers that they gave you. So if you had a cell phone with Verizon, for example, if you wanted to switch providers to AT&T, you would have to get a new cell phone number, tell all of your friends and family your new number, and probably miss a lot of important calls. The government decided to pass a regulation that cell phone numbers had to move with the person, right? The cell phone number belonged to you. Essentially, companies had to transfer the cell phone number to a new provider when you switch providers. So that's not something that would break a large company into chunks. It is something that would reduce the degree to which you're willing to pay more for your current provider than for a different provider, and therefore increase the level of competition in the market. What if we didn't want to break up monopolies or directly interfere with their ability to have market power over consumers? Well, another alternative would be to cap their price. So if I have a monopolist who has got a downward sloping demand curve, right? And an upward sloping marginal cost. The fundamental problem, right, that I'm trying to resolve is that they're going to charge a price like P star, right, above their marginal cost. So one way to deal with this, one way to address this, might be to just force them to charge a lower price, right, impose a lower price on them. So the maximum price you can charge, right, is where price equals marginal cost. Let's say that their original price is 30, maybe push them down to a price of 20. Now the reason that this would solve our real problem, our fundamental problem, which is not enough output, is because at this higher price, the monopolist was perfectly happy to sell more stuff, right? They would have loved to sell even more stuff than the socially optimal level of output. The problem is no one was willing to buy their stuff, right, beyond their monopolist output. So if we force them to charge a lower price, they no longer have the ability to keep prices higher by producing less output. They'll just go ahead and produce where price equals marginal cost, right? In other words, they'll produce here. So we can get them to produce more output by forcing them to charge a lower price. The reason is by doing this, we reduce their incentive, right, to keep prices high by reducing levels of output. So this is another option. By capping their price, we might be able to increase the amount of economic gains that go to consumers, but also have the ability to get to closer to an efficient level of output. The only problem with this, well, there's two problems with this. The first problem is this requires a lot of knowledge on the part of regulators, right? If I'm a government regulator responsible for capping the prices of some monopoly supplier, I need to know a lot about the costs of that firm, right? And I need to know a lot about the likely fixed costs that go into producing output to know whether I'm capping them at the right price, right? If I cap them at too low of a price, I might drive them out of the market entirely. The other problem with this is that if part of the reason that we allow monopolies, or even in some cases encourage or defend monopolies, is in order to give firms enough profit to give them an incentive to produce, capping their price is going to reduce the amount of profit that they earn, right? The monopolist profits are going to go from being this trapezoid to being this triangle here, right? They're going to gain this little rectangle here, or this little triangle here. They're going to lose this whole rectangle here. And so if we're trying to encourage innovation, right, by allowing monopolists to recoup their expenses, we might not want to cap the profits of some kinds of monopolists. This brings us to our third option, which might seem a little counterintuitive, which is maybe instead of capping the price that monopolists can charge, we should subsidize their output. Why does this make sense? Well, the fundamental problem we're trying to solve, our efficiency problem, is too little output. So if we give the firms, let's say $2 per unit that they produce, we're going to get them to produce more output. Right? In other words, we have some demand function like this, right? Marginal revenue like this, marginal cost, right? We want to increase our output. One of the ways we can do that is just by giving the firm a certain price per unit, right, in order to encourage them to produce more output. Now, we wouldn't do this to the De Beers Diamond Corporation, right, because we might not want to transfer public money into the hands of a large, highly profitable monopolist. But if we thought about, for example, medical device manufacturers, right, or drug makers, we might really be comfortable doing something like this. Even if we thought about something like poets or artists, we might think we want to subsidize, we want to encourage innovation, we want to encourage development of medical devices. By increasing the revenue that each firm's going to get, we're also going to expand the number of people who have access to new medications. And there's one last option I want to talk about, and then I'll let you guys go. The last option I want to talk about is to do nothing. So this is generally associated with an economist named Joseph Schumpeter, who argued that the profit-seeking motive by itself in a competitive marketplace is going to put any monopolist who's earning high profits under immense competitive pressure. In other words, if you see the De Beers Diamond Corporation earning massive amounts of money in the diamond industry, you're going to be thinking a lot about how you can get yourself a chunk of that industry. And over time, he argued that this would result in a process which he called creative destruction, which is essentially that new firms or new techniques are going to move in and destroy and supplant the market position of existing incumbent firms. And there's a lot of stories suggesting this can work, right? So we talked about Microsoft having 97% market share in 2000. Well, at this point, they've got about 35% market share of operating systems. That's not because the government broke them up. It's because the development of tablets and cell phones resulted in an opportunity for new competitors to come in offering better tablet and cell phone market operating systems. So at this point, Android is a much larger provider of operating systems than Microsoft is. Likewise with De Beers, right? They had their monopoly because they had almost all of the proven diamond reserves in the world in South Africa. But the high price of diamonds led people to go explore northern Canada and discover massive diamond deposits in Canada, in Australia, and in Russia, which resulted in competition to De Beers. So that now they similarly control less than 50% of the overall diamond market. And some people might argue that this is actually the safest option because these other regulatory options can result in a regulatory apparatus that's working so closely with the monopolist that they end up supporting and protecting the monopolist from competition rather than reducing the monopolist's power. Okay, so that's all I've got for you today. Thank you so much for sticking with me. I'm looking forward to talking to you all about this soon.